Welcome to yet another episode of Quilt at the Long Arm Quilting Show. I'm your host, Jody Davis, and my guest today is Melissa Krushwitz, who uses ProStitcher, which is a computerized system for the Handy Quilter machine, to design her quilting patterns. Now, whenever I've finished a quilt top, I've got to think about, well, what am I going to put on it? What am I going to use for my quilting designs? And often when you actually stitch it out, it isn't exactly what you thought it was going to be. Now, you could have done that maybe on clear paper and you can rehearse it on then, something like that. But Melissa takes it a step further because you actually design it all. You have the quilt in there and you've designed the design and you know for sure what it's going to look like when that thing goes on the machine and you start stitching it.
I do, Jody. I'm a very traditional quilter at my heart, and I like stitching pieced patchwork quilts in my studio in Florida. I've taken the simulation software, which Handy Quilter was wonderful to give us last year, and I've just taken it to the next step so that I can pick my designs, I can set those designs up in the simulation software, I can get a feel for how that looks, how do they play together, how does the density work, and then when I'm done setting it all up, I just transfer it onto my jump drive, I put it in my ProStitcher, and it's all set and ready to go. I don't have to waste that time at the ProStitcher at the machine. I'm a busy long armer. One goes on, one comes off, and I just need to be stitching. Simulation lets me do that.
So you could just be working anywhere on your laptop to be doing your simulation.
Exactly, and that's exactly what I do in my studio. So if I have a quilt on the frame, my ProStitcher is maybe just stitching an edge to edge. I never like to leave the room when that's happening, but I can just sit right on my computer. I have my next one all lined up, ready to go. I've measured it. I know exactly the size. I sit on my simulator and I get it all set up. Everything's pre-sized, pre-laid out. All I have to do is step up to the machine and I'm gonna place it, do my areas, do all my skew functionality once I load the quilt.
Wow, no surprises.
No surprises.
You know, I love this about you, that you say you're a very traditional quilter, but you're using real high tech, which is a wonderful marriage, the best of both.
So where I wanted to start today was for pantographs. When we get these machines and we buy the ProStitcher, we're all beginners at that point, and we want to just learn how to do pantographs. So I'm going to give you maybe a little bit different spin on some of the other videos or maybe some of the other training that people have received. I call it the MK way, but try to stick with me through it, and there is method to my madness, I promise you. Okay, so the first thing we're going to do is we're going to open up the pantograph that we're using. And today I'm using a pantograph that came free with the ProStitcher update last summer. It's called Twisted Feather by Jessica Schick from the Digitech. And so when I work with a pantograph, I open it up. The very first thing that I do is I evaluate the pattern in its raw form. How big is it to start with? I'm a little bit of a control freak. I like to know how big it's going to stitch before I actually start working with it. So I'm gonna take this pattern because it's a little tall for me. And you'll notice I'm kind of blinged up here today. A lot of times I will just keep a regular old tape measure around my neck. ProStitcher has a ruler on it, and I love the ruler on the ProStitcher. But sometimes I need to look at the pattern and I need to judge the quilt to know if I think I like the size of that. So I keep that handy all the time. I think this is 11.5 inches high approximately. I'm going to want to resize that, and I'm just taking a guess here. I'm going to resize it down to 7. Now, when you're working in simulation, if you see these lines here and they might be a little distracting, just click on the file button and those lines will go away. The other thing in simulation, we can work with our grid on or a grid off. It's personal preference. And the other thing is, here's the sim button. So the sim button, when you're working on a laptop, if you depress simulation and then you click and hold, that simulates us moving our machine, which we all know the crosshairs is where our needle is. Okay, so I'm just going to move those crosshairs out of the way so that they're off to the side and not distracting us. Okay, I've resized the pattern. The next thing I want to do is I want to repeat this pattern to a width that's longer than I would ever be able to use it. Okay? I'm going to do that I'm going to manually repeat it for right now. If we have time later, I'll show you a quicker way to do it. But I'm just going to manually repeat this. I'm just going to shoot for 11 side to side.
Neat.
Okay, it took it up to 125 inches wide. I'm going to go up to 12. All right, so that's 136 inches wide. That's wider than any of us would ever be able to stitch it. I'm just going to pan this over a little bit so we can see. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to hit baseline. And we all know that baseline is our friend when we're working with ProStitcher. And what that did was it took away all of those start and stop points in there. Okay, we have one new pattern. Now the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to repeat it vertically. I'm going to repeat it maybe about 5 or 6 or 7 times, depends on the pattern. I'm going to repeat it that way so that when I'm ready to use it, all I have to do is lay it down on my quilt, crop off the edges, and stitch. One little caveat with this technique. I only use this when I'm stitching completely edge to edge, so I'm stitching off into the batting on all 4 sides of the quilt.
Okay.
Also, it's not a directional design. Doesn't matter which way I load the quilt. I can load it either horizontally or vertically. It's not going to matter, okay? And the other thing is that the pattern or the quilt itself, nothing is directional about this, okay?
Okay.
All right, so let's go ahead and repeat it vertically. Let's take it up to 6 vertical repeats. All right, now I'm going to turn my grid on because I want to show you how I adjust the spacing. Okay, to zoom in when you're using simulation, you just click and hold, and I'm just pulling out so that I can see those little boxes right there. See how eventually it turned from 1 gray box to 4 boxes within?
Keeps adding.
All right, so this, I can quickly scan this pattern, and it tells me that this is almost 3 inches apart. Here's 1 inch, here's 2 inch, and almost a 1/3 inch. So over here on our distance, we can manually depress this minus button until that distance closes down for us.
Oh,
but
wow.
because I've visually been able to see how far apart it was, I'm just going to click the distance button. I'm going to click clear, and then I'm just going to go -2.5 just to see how close it gets me.
Oh, wow. Oh, wow.
So
totally different.
I guessed pretty well on that one. I'm a quilter that likes a little bit denser, tighter quilting, so I like to shoot for between 1/4 and 1/2 inch apart. So that looks actually perfect.
But
to
not
me.
only that, it has a whole different effect. The other was very much a path.
Right.
And this is not
You
going
want
to
to
have that
hide
effect at all.
you want to hide those stitching paths, exactly.
Or not.
Or not. You're the boss of your pantograph, so you size it to the size that you want. Okay, now the next thing that we have to evaluate is we have unfilled in space up here, and if we were to quilt this on our quilt, we wouldn't want this area of unquilted space at the top.
Right.
So there's a couple of options. We can use ProStitcher's wrapping function, or we can just crop that off when we actually step up to the quilt. I have skipped over a couple steps that I want to go back to. Once I've gotten it to this point, I want to go ahead and save that because I don't want to lose what I've just done.
Oh,
okay?
number 1 rule, right?
Number 1 rule. And I'm not going to baseline, however, because if I baseline right now, I'm going to lose my wrapping functionality. But I can go ahead and save. So let's just go ahead and save. Click on that box down there, click on clear, and I'm just going to give it a name, 01 Master Panto. Now, just a little bit with my naming game. I put 01 in front of things a lot so that it pops it to the top of the list. That's the only reason I use 01. So if I use 01 a lot, just roll with it. Okay, so I have saved it. I should still be able to use my wrapping functionality now to fill in this top space that's unquilted.
Okay.
So that I don't have to worry about that when I get up to the quilt.
And so it's all filled.
It's all filled. Because generally speaking, the top of our quilt is straight across, right? So we want this to be straight across. Okay, so let's go back over into our repeat function over here now, and let's go to wrapping. And remember, you can choose to do this or you can wait and do this at the quilt, but let's go through it since we're working in simulation. And let's just zoom in a little bit so that we can see it a little better. All right, we're going to do a closed crop here, a closed wrap, because remember I told you we're going to stitch off into the batting. This closed wrap is going to create stitching lines for us, and we don't care that it's creating a stitching line because we're going to trim that off anyway.
Yep.
Okay, so we're going to use closed. Now we have 2 options to choose from on our wrapping here. Let's just do a little trial and error to see which one we like better, okay? Let's try this one down here. See how it filled in that space at the top?
Yeah.
And so now we have a nice even line across the top that we can just place at the top of our quilt and be ready. Now there's one little difference that I want you to notice when I choose this option right here. So I'm going to go to my undo feature. I'm going to undo what we just did. Now I'm going to select this one up here. I want you to watch the difference. So didn't look too much different, did it?
No, I'm saying, am I missing something here?
There's a slight difference here. It filled in the space, but it did not crop off any of this next row.
Oh.
Okay, so what is on my screen right now is the second row, but ultimately it's going to become our first row because we're only ever going to stitch that top row once, right?
Yeah.
We only have one top of our quilt.
Right.
So we're going to stitch that cropped row once, then we're going to get rid of it. And I'm going to show you that actually at the machine. Okay, this looks perfect to me. I like the spacing, I like the wrapping, I like everything about this. So now I'm going to baseline. Baseline is our friend, and I'm going to save it again. As we're working through these episodes, Jody, and with simulation, you're going to see that I do a lot of saving.
Yeah.
And it may seem repetitive to some of our viewers, but there is a reason for that. And stick with me as we get further down the road. It's always better to save and be able to get yourself back to a previous step than have lost everything you just did. Okay? So I'm going to save it again. And this time I'm going to call it 01. I'll call it Master Panto, and I'm just going to call it after. That's a little abbreviation I use for just a trigger to me that this was after I did the wrapping. Okay? So we are ready now to step up to our Pro Stitcher and stitch this out.
Great.
Okay?
Let's do it. But before that, you need your zinger so that you're an official star on the Handy Quilter on
Thank you, Handy
Quilt at the
Quilter.
Long Arm Quilting Show. Yes.
Okay, Jody. We stepped away from my laptop with the simulation software. I had saved that pantograph onto my flash drive. I'm going to stick it right here in my Infinity. And my tablet should recognize that it's there. And then we're going to open up what we just saved. All right? And I'm going to need to back up here to the D drive. There's my flash drive. Here's all my files. Okay, so I usually create a folder for each quilt I'm working on or each customer I'm working on.
Stay organized.
Okay. Here's my Panto exercise, and there's that 01 Master Panto, the after version that we saved. Okay, so I'm going to open that file. Okay, I've loaded, there it is, I've loaded my quilt. We don't have to touch it right now. What we're going to do now is define an area on our quilt.
Okay.
So again, we're stitching out into the batting, right? So we're going to go a little bit to the left, a little bit to the top. We're going to depress the area button. There we go. Okay. And I'm working on an Infinity today, and one of the main selling points for Infinity for me was the ability to mark with the handlebars. This is amazing. Okay, so we're going to put our first mark over here. Then we're going to drag our machine down close to our rail, off the side, and we're going to put our second mark over here. I'm going to refresh my screen so that I can see. Okay. Now, at this point, I do something a little bit non-standard. Whatever amount of distance top to bottom that was, I've just marked myself 13.72 inches. I'm going to change that to a height that's higher, taller than this pattern that I just created, because I don't want to crop anything off at this point. I'm still just defining my space. So I usually am able to take it up to about 40 inches. That's higher than I would ever need it. Okay, my pattern is still selected. Now I'm going to align it. I'm going to align that right inside of there. Now I'm going to do crop. I'm going to close. I'm going to do an outside crop. That looks good to me. I'm going to baseline, and the very last thing I'm going to do is align it to the top. Okay, it should be all ready to go. Let's see if we did everything right, Jody, and let's stitch it out. We're going to check our settings. I'm not going to use the tie-off, but we'll let it run. So see how easy that was to get that all set up ahead of time?
Absolutely.
All we had to do was load our quilt, pull that pattern in, and it's ready to stitch.
That's right.
We haven't had to waste any time actually at the machine doing all of that setup.
So the green is your beginning and the red is your stop. And is that going to fill this whole thing?
So how I handle pantographs is I just stitch a few rows. However many rows that I can fit in my throat depth, I will stitch as far as I can go, and then I'm going to have to advance.
Right.
I'll just stop the pattern at that point, and I'll advance my quilt. One thing that I do is I do marking out into my batting so that when I advance, I can easily find my spot again. Sometimes I use a pin. I always have my pins handy, so sometimes I'll put a pin there. Sometimes I'll actually use a permanent marker. Just be very careful if you're using a permanent marker. You want to step well away to the side of your quilt, put that mark in, cover it back up, and get this away
Don't let it fall.
Don't let it be on your quilt at all. So that's as easy as it is to take the time in your easy chair at night, or
Yeah.
when you have time when a quilt is stitching on your Pro Stitcher. Go through the patterns that you know and love. You know how dense you like them. Just get them set up so that the next time you want to use that pattern, you load your quilt, you step up to the machine, pull up the pattern, just crop it off a little bit, and you're stitching in a fraction of the amount of time.
That's amazing. So when you decided first what size you wanted to make that first little bit that you took, that's actually the size it's going to stitch out, but then you could scale it here.
If I wanted to make any changes in the size of it, I could do that here.
Okay.
There was one thing that I didn't mention at the very beginning. Sometimes if it's a new pattern that I'm using and I've never stitched it before, I will actually pull it up on my Pro Stitcher, not on my simulation.
Okay.
I'll actually pull it up at the machine and I'll take a look at it, I'll place it down, I'll just do some air stitching. Okay, so I can make the machine move without the needle moving, and I can just kind of see how big that pattern is. That gives me an idea how big I wanted to start that pattern at.
Okay.
Okay,
Good.
but if I get to a quilt where I just think somehow the sizing just isn't right, I can take that pattern once I open it up and I can just adjust it a little bit. I can go a little bit bigger, I can go a little bit smaller, crop it off and stitch. Okay, so we've stitched it out, Jody. We're at the end of the row. Now there's one step that I want to make sure the viewers understand. This top row was a cropped row, right?
Right.
We did all that wrapping step and we cropped this.
Yep.
We don't ever want to stitch that row again, do we?
No, that would throw off your pattern when you
Yes.
got down farther.
Right. I did that one day in my studio.
I'm sure.
It was not a happy day. I was able to fix it, but why don't we get rid of that row so that we don't have to worry about that?
Eliminate the problem.
Eliminate the
from
problem,
happening.
exactly. So I'm just gonna stop this pattern right now. I'll go ahead and clip my thread with my zinger, with my scissor. Thank you again, Handy Quilter. Okay, what I wanna do is I wanna skip to the next start point for the next row. So let's just kind of move the machine into position, and we can see a little bit clearer when we do that where that start point is. And I'm just depressing this little right-hand arrow over here, and I've just jumped myself now to that next full row, correct?
Right.
Okay, we're gonna go back to design, we're gonna do crop, and we have a new feature called crop start and end.
Oh, neat.
What that is Pro Stitcher will now crop out anything that's before our green circle. What's before our green circle now?
That top row
That top row that we don't want. What's after our end point?
Nothing.
Nothing, we don't care about that. So let's hit start and end, and it's gone. Never to be stitched again. I'm gonna baseline, and then I'm gonna clear the area, and what am I gonna do because I do it so much? I'm gonna save.
Yes.
I'm gonna save again. A lot of it seems repetitive, but believe me, it can save you. And I'm just gonna call this right now, usually I call it the name of my customer. So this is gonna be Jody's quilt. 01 Jody. Okay, remember the 01 is just so it puts it at the top of the list. Now we've done no other repositioning or anything, so we are ready to stitch our next row. And I did want to mention I'm stitching today with the glide foot on.
Yes.
This is one of my newest, favoriteest feet that Handy Quilter introduced last summer. The glide foot, if you're stitching on anything that has a little bit of a loft to it, maybe your customer's quilt has some pretty bulky seams in there, just a whole load of reasons why this has become my favorite foot. It almost exclusively lives on my machine at home.
I was going to ask you, so when do you not use it?
So we're going to transition now into a new episode with the borders.
Okay.
We're going to transition into border work. I actually transition off the glide foot and put on an echo foot to do my border work.
Oh, interesting. Oh, echo foot, of course, yes.
Okay.
There's a reason. Yes, great. Well, now you know what we're going to do in the next segment, so stick with us for more of Quilt It, the Long Arm Quilting Show with MK Quilts.
Thank you.
It's time for more of Quilt It, the Long Arm Quilting Show with my guest, Melissa Krushwitz, and she's using the simulator of the Pro Stitcher to actually design her quilting so she knows exactly what she's going to get when she gets to the long arm. And the cool thing is that you started out with pantographs in the last segment and then stitched them out and showed us how it's going to look on our on the computer and then on the machine. Right. And now you're actually going to do all the parts of the quilt, whether you have blocks, sashing, borders, different blocks, whatever. There it is, and there it'll be.
Exactly. So, Jody, I like this step because it takes you from just being a beginner.
Yeah.
And I do a lot of teaching, and I work with a lot of ProStitcher users that that's all they feel like they can do. But with simulation, I can show them how to build the borders, very simple borders, and so that they feel like they can take their stitching to the next level.
Yeah, you've done this. Well, it's not much different to do the border because it's kind of, yeah.
So the first style of borders that I teach my students is, I call them offset borders. Okay, so we're going to build ourselves a border, but we're going to offset it from the left-hand side and stitch off the right. Then on the bottom, we'll offset it in the other direction, so that we have not had to worry about a corner unit at all.
It's like building a log cabin, kind of, because of the corners go together?
Exactly. So the other thing that I like to do with simulation when I'm doing layouts is I look at my quilt, I start dreaming up what I want to do, and then I decide, am I going to work on the inside and build out, or am I going to work on the outside and build in? On this particular quilt, let's start in the center and work our way to the borders. So some of this pantograph that I'm going to set up is going to be just a tad bit of a review, and then we'll move on to the borders.
Okay.
Okay. So I have taken some measurements on our quilt. Obviously, we've taken a quilt in. We have to measure it. So we know what size the inside area is. We know how big our sashes are, and we know how big our borders are. Okay, so we're going to open our pattern, and then we're going to set an area to work with.
Okay.
So let's open the pattern that I've chosen. And it's this star edge to edge, which is a handy quilter pattern, so our users can try this on their ProStitchers at home. Then I'm going to create an area that matches the area of my inside area of my quilt. So I'm going to go to area, and I'm going to manually type in 17.5 by 17.5. Now, one thing when you work in simulation with doing layouts, as you get more complicated layouts, a lot of times things will pop around on the screen. So this becomes your friend. Select all, which right now we only have one pattern open, but further down the line we'll have more patterns open. So select all, and refresh. And that will pop everything back on the screen so that you can see it, because it starts like going all over the place. All right, so again, like we did before, let's evaluate this pattern. Well, this pattern is 10 inches tall, and I think that's probably a little bit too big for the way that I want to use it. So I'm just going to go ahead and I'm going to resize this right down. So I'm going to go under resize, and I'm going to take it down to, oh, I don't know, let's try 7 again. That was a good number before. Now this time, instead of repeating it manually like we did before, I'm going to let ProStitcher fill in these repeats for me. Okay, so it's going to do the work for me. I go under repeat, under main, and I'm going to hit the fit button. And it fits it in there as best as it could, right? But we still have some space that's not filled. So now we have some decisions to make. We can either put more repeats in there, but that's going to scrunch it down and make it tighter. We might not want that. In this particular case, all I'm going to do is use my stretch width and my stretch height, and I think that looks pretty good. That filled the space nicely. It's nice and spaced together, so I don't have to mess with the distance this time. I think this looks good to me. So I'm going to baseline, and another new step that we're going to do in layout and in rendering. We're going to start naming our patterns so that later on down the road, we know that we've saved everything we've needed and we've named it properly. Okay, so if you look up on the top right-hand side, under Select, here's a button called Single. Well, right now, when we did that repeating process, it called it Repeat Group 16.
What does that mean?
It doesn't mean anything to me. So let's give it a new name. There's the name button, and I'm just going to call this Inside Panto. So now I know that I've created my inside panto.
And that makes sense.
Now here's the key. Naming it does not save it. So I'm a saver. So immediately after naming, we're going to save it. So you're going to see me do that over and over again. We're going to name it, and then we're going to save it. Okay?
Good. Yeah, how'd you learn that lesson?
Yeah, the hard way,
well,
I can assure you.
You may have read the manual first.
Well, I guess I did many moons ago. Okay. So we have done the inside area of our pantograph. Now, this is 17.5 inches. For me on my Infinity, I can stitch that out at that depth.
Okay.
Some people might not be able to do that on their machine. You can just break down that pattern when you actually step up to the machine by doing the start and end that we did prior and doing that crop feature where we're cropping off some of those rows so that we create for ourselves a good distance to stitch in. We're going to leave it and move on. Okay, we're done with this area, so let's clear that. The next pattern that I've chosen is a narrow sash. It's just like a circle bubble sash, a very simple sash. Now that's a 1-inch sash because I've measured my quilt. So this was 17.5. I'm going to add an inch on either side. It's going to take me to 19.5. Okay, let's create a new area that's 19.5. by 19.5. Did I get that right, Jody?
I think so.
Okay, I'm going to go ahead and turn my grid off. It's a little bit distracting to me. And again, I'm going to move my crosshairs out of the way. Now, we created a new area, so the pattern that we just created is not correctly aligned, is it?
No, it's not in the center.
All right, so we have align features. Let's go to align, and let's align it to the center, both vertically and
how
horizontally.
nice. Oh.
Now let's just go ahead and open that sash that we want to use. There it is, double circle. Again, it's a free with our Handy Quilter Pro Stitcher. What do we need to do? First thing, we need to evaluate. How big is it? Well, lo and behold, this one is exactly the size we need it to be. So we don't need to resize it. Okay? So what I'm going to show you now is a little trick for aligning and repeating. I want to build this border to fill this space, right?
Right.
I want to take and manually repeat it once. I want to take this from 1 to 2. I want to make sure it's on point to point. And then I'm going to align it to the center and to the top. Now that I've locked that alignment, I can continue with my repeating, and it will hold that alignment as I build it. Okay, so I'm just going to watch it with my eyes, and I'm going to repeat it until it gets to fill the space. Okay, it's a little bit over at that point, isn't it? Let's use our stretch feature again. That's brought it right back into where it needs to be. I like how it looks. Baseline is our friend. That gets rid of all of those start and stop points. What do we want to do? We want to name it.
Yep.
Click on select. Repeat double circle. I don't like that. Let's call this sash top.
That works.
Naming it didn't save it, did it?
Nope.
What are we going to do?
Save it.
Save it. Okay, now let me move this over a little bit so that we can see it. I'm just going to hit pan, and I'm going to move this over so we can see it a little bit better. I want this border down here, don't I?
You sure do.
But I don't want to take all those steps to recreate that again.
No, can you duplicate that one?
I can duplicate
Yay.
this one. Duplicate is going to become our new friend when we do layout and renderings. So this is not a directional border in any way, shape, or form. So I'm just going to duplicate it, and I'm going to put it down here at the bottom. So let's align it to the center and align it to the bottom. Now, we wouldn't necessarily have to name it, but I'm kind of a creature of habit, so we're going to call this sash bottom. And we have now named it, but we haven't saved it, so we'll click save it. Okay, next step, we need to fill in the sides, don't we?
Yes, but if you just turned it and duplicated it, you'd be doing the circles twice.
Right, so I am going to take the time to recreate this on the side so that it fits in there more precisely.
Okay.
Okay, so let's open it. Let's open our circle pattern again. There it is. This time I'm going to flip it. I'm going to rotate it that way, and I'm going to repeat it now vertically instead of horizontally. Okay, so we need to go into repeat, and again, we're going to put it on one repeat. We're going to put it on point to point. We're going to lock our alignment, and then we will continue to repeat it so that it will fill the space. If this box starts to get in your way, just hit the single button and that will disappear.
Oh, good.
All right, here we go. Repeat. We're just going to repeat it manually until it gets to be about what it needs to be. Okay, it's a little bit over, isn't it?
Yeah.
We know what this dimension is because we measured our quilt, didn't we? So let's just go and manually resize that. Let's go to height, unlock our aspect. We know that that measurement is 17.5 from a previous step, and because we measured our quilt, now it's exactly the size it needs to be. Let's baseline it. We'll double check our alignment, but I'm pretty sure it held the alignment. Yes, it did.
Good.
We're going to name it. Repeat.
Sash.
Yep, we'll
right.
call it sash right. Now, I'm going to take a little bit of a detour here, Jody. Sash right. And that doesn't save it, so I'm going to save it. Now, again, on my Infinity, I could stitch out that sash at 17.5, but some people cannot. So I teach my students a couple of different ways to handle borders that are too deep for their throat depth. You could break that border down when you're actually stitching it, or you could chunk it. Chunking is a term that we quilters use for being able to stitch vertical borders as we quilt along.
Okay.
So you could chunk that at the machine. I like to teach my beginners how to chunk it. I call it pre-chunking it. So we're going to break this border down before we even step up to the machine. So let's do a little bit of math. If we take 17.5 and we divide it by 2, that gives us 8.25.
Yep.
All right, so let's open our border, And let's just create for ourselves a unit that is going to be 8 1/4. We're going to repeat it again vertically, point to point. And now we're just going to manually repeat this until it gets to the height we need it. Here's what we're watching right there. Okay, up to 6, up to 8. So we're almost there.
But 1/4, yeah, we're going to
So
get there.
one more is not going to do it, so we're going to have to go back to 4. And let's just resize that to what we know we need it to be. Let's make it 8 1/4. Okay, so it's just it's basically we're accomplishing the same thing. It's just a couple of different ways that you can do it.
Okay.
Okay, so now we have a chunk. So let's go ahead and give it a name. We have sash chunk. And we're gonna use that sash when we get to our quilt. Let's save it. Now, I'm trying to accomplish a layout and a rendering. I want a picture of this. So let's just repeat this because we can. And then let's just align it because we can.
And then we have our quilt.
And then we have that step is ready for us. Okay, so we've completed our inner sashing, and now we would take it to the next step and add our outer border.
Right, but we don't have enough time for that. But that's not a problem because Melissa teaches a class on how to do it, and it's an offset border.
Yep.
So this was not an offset border, but
Correct.
the other one is you can learn something else, and we'll tell you all about her website. But we will stitch that all out after we come back. But first, we need to get to Marie, who's going to do one of her short takes on long arm quilting. So we'll have more with Melissa when we come back. And in the meantime, off to Marie. Marie, that Melissa is a dynamo. She's rabid for quilting. I think she quilts or works on her simulator like 24 hours a day.
She wears me out. I have a stool.
How convenient.
I have to sit down. She wears me out. Oh, you know, the thing is with Melissa is you're seeing quilters want to quilt a lot.
Yes.
Right? And we can't always quilt all day, you know, and some things that will help us to stretch out that quilting time are nice stools. So this is one that has a back on it.
Yeah.
So this is a nice one, and you know, this is another really nice thing. This infinity, which I don't know if she liked it or not. What do you think?
Well, she just didn't say a word about it, about anything,
I
any
know.
feature that she liked or anything.
Yeah. Well, here's another feature, is we can move these handlebars so they're down here. We can adjust them a lot of different ways, but you know, when I do micro quilting, I'm kind of in the same spot a long time. So a stool is part of my tools.
Rather than standing.
And, yeah. And I'm sitting here and I can reach this. Also, when I'm using rulers. So rulers, I'm sitting here kind of in the same spot a long time. Any excuse I can use to use a stool, right? So I can sit
But also
here.
switching off from standing to sitting and
Standing
changing
and sitting.
your posture.
And so, funny you should mention that. So, Kimmy Brunner has
I love Kimmy.
I know, right? So she has the high-rise system on her machine, which what it does is it raises and lowers the machine. So you can see we have a set of buttons here, and you just press the button. You can have presets that it goes up a little ways, up a lot, down a little ways, down a lot. You press the button, and she says it makes the difference in being able to quilt half day and whole day.
Really?
So that's one thing
Wow.
for her. Now, a lot of people are not able to stand, and so that makes a big difference for those. So I want to introduce you. I have models today.
Oh,
I
wonderful.
have friends. I know that shocks you, right? Okay, so I have friends that are come to help us out today. And so the first one will be Kathy, and this is Carrie, who works in this studio with me. It's her twin sister.
Aw.
And so Kathy is in a wheelchair. She is able to quilt because she can lower
it.
the frame. And so she can just move right up to it.
Wow.
But if she gets elbowed out, then Carrie comes in.
My turn, time's up.
And they do share. And so Carrie is going to show us, what you can see is the camel, or the saddle chair. So you would recognize that,
Yes,
right?
yes,
you
yes.
know, and that makes it comfortable.
It changes
And
your
it's-
pelvis posture, you know, the
yeah,
way you're tilted.
Yeah, and so a lot of people like that stool because it's comfortable. And you can sit on that one and quilt longer,
Yep.
right?
Yep.
Okay, and then the next one is Cheryl. And Cheryl also works in the studio. And so this one is awesome in that it has the wheels on it and you can scoot along.
Oh, as you move
and
along
so,
on your
yeah, you can
quilt.
just go back and forth. So we can get as much quilting in as we possibly can, right?
Yes,
Which
yes.
is what we're after, right?
Yes.
So there you go.
Wonderful.
I'm worn out. I don't know if I can go back and watch Melissa.
Yeah, well, no, yes, you can. Yes, you can. You just start quilting, and I bet you can keep going, and we'll get one of these other chairs, and you can switch.
How do you
can
think
change
she'd feel if I finished just, you get your hands on the machine and you just want to start quilting?
Well, I think she understands that, so go ahead. We'll be back with more of Melissa and her working with the simulator in our next episode of, or segment of, Quilt at the Long Arm Quilting Show. Thank you, Marie, as always. It's time for more Pro Stitcher simulation fun with Melissa Krushwitz and the Infinity Handy Quilter. So you've done the designing with the simulator, and you did the quilt itself, you did the sashing, you did the border, and now you've put your drive in to the machine and you're ready to rip.
Yes. So we ran out of time a little bit at the end of the last session. So I've created this border, and now I want to talk about placing the border and using Skew 2 functionality.
Okay.
It was another huge update that Handy Quilter did for us last year, the whole skew process. It's made, if our quilt's a little bit crooked, or if we've loaded things a little bit crooked, Skew 2 is going to come to the rescue.
Oh, wow.
So
No wonder you're excited.
let's talk about the foot that I've changed out. This is an Echo foot, and Handy Quilter sells them in a set of 3. Now, most people are going to use their Echo feet for ruler work and that type of thing. I use it for placing my borders because this is the 3/8 inch one, I believe, and it gives me a nice distance from the edge of my quilt so that I don't place things too close to the edge, because
So you can bind it.
I can bind it. I don't want my binding to cover up my stitching, okay? So the first thing I'm going to do, I have my border loaded. I'm going to come in here, and I'm a quilter that likes my borders to come pretty close to my seam line. You can make a determination how close you like it. I like it pretty close. So I'm going to loosely place this pattern where it needs to be, and that's just so that I can kind of follow it on the screen. Now, we already talked about the fact that I love my Infinity because I can do all of this multi-point marking right on my handlebars. Okay, so I am going to go across my quilt now. I'm going to depress area. And with my right hand handlebar, I can mark across this quilt. And anywhere where there might be a bobble or something's a little crooked or not where it needs to be, I'm putting a mark. And I'm doing that right on my handlebar. Okay, I'm coming up to the edge using my Echo foot as a guide. And I'm just going right to the edge of the quilt, put my last mark right there, go up, and then again across. And anywhere where I need to put a mark, I'm just marking with my handlebar.
And it's really going to
And it's
make
going
up for
to
that?
skew it right in there. Now I'm just glancing at my screen so that I know I'm right on top of that first mark that I did. I'm going to put my last mark right there. And now I can obviously see that my border is too big for that area box. Well, let's go ahead and go to Skew. We're going to do Skew 2, and the Pro Stitcher is going to just skew that right into the area. So if our border was a little crooked, not to worry. It's going to be perfectly stitched. I'm in a baseline. I don't like stitching with my area on, so I'm going to clear my area. And what am I going to do before I stitch?
Save.
I'm going to save, okay? And that is just a really good habit to get into, so that if you have anything go wrong, power glitch, anything, if you've saved it, you're going to be happy. You're happy. All right, so we are ready to go. We're going to stitch. I'm going to turn on my tie-offs this time, and I'm going to go. Now, Jody, while this is stitching out, I want to segue into the next thing that I want to show you how to do. And that are some of my whole cloth layouts.
Ooh, fun.
Like the quilt that you're seeing behind me. Okay, so this would stitch out. In days gone by, I would never turn my back on a border because if it was a little off, but I've skewed it, so I know that it's going to be perfect.
Because
Okay?
otherwise it could be going off and you would be gone.
It would be stitching into my quilt or off the edge, and I would not be happy.
Yes.
So we're going to let this stitch as we transition back over to my laptop
Okay.
and do simulation, and I want to talk about my favorite thing for simulation, which is whole cloth layout.
Cool. Okay, let's do
Okay,
it.
let's do it.
So this is it finished.
This is it finished, actually in a whole cloth version, Jody.
Oh.
So we set up the designs initially to fit that specific quilt. Now, when we did that, I didn't pay any attention to stitch order. I just laid it out. I knew I was saving all of those steps individually, and I was going to place them and skew them as we saw with that beautiful border. Now, we could have stitched it out as a whole cloth. Even though I didn't pay attention to stitch order, I can skip around between my start and stop points and stitch it out. Well, I just so happened to have done that before I came today. And so this is what it would look like as a whole cloth. That's the next thing we're going to talk about, and it's become my love with my simulation, is to just sit and dream and design and use those thousands of patterns that I've accumulated into whole cloth layouts.
And then it's all about the stitching.
It's all about the beautiful stitching.
Oh, that's
Here's
pretty.
another version that's just a whole cloth that I designed. I just stitched this on fleece. There's no batting in here. Just tied it like you would normally tie a fleece blanket. It's a beautiful pattern, and I've got a baby gift if I need it.
Real snuggly.
Yes. All right.
Oh.
So here's the next
pretty.
one. This is a whole cloth that is done with stitch order in mind.
Okay.
So I'm going to go through the layout. I'm going to show you that at simulation. There's just going to be a couple different nuances. When we're done setting it up, we want to get the stitching in order so that we can stitch the top border, then we can move on to this triangle. However much we can stitch before we advance, that's how we want to think about it. Mentally think through the layout before we get to the end.
Okay, right,
So
right.
let's go back to the laptop and let's lay this one out.
Okay, can you just tell me what this is, though? It feels...
Oh, yeah. This,
Meshy.
It is. And this was my second attempt, the fleece being the first, of stitching on something non-traditional. So it's just a cotton on the back. Then I laid down a cotton bat, a very thin cotton bat. Then I put a fluffy poly bat over the top of it.
Oh.
Then I put down a layer of lace. Then I put down a layer of sheer. So if you look at this really close, you can see this little white kind of shining through. That's just the batting shining through the two other layers of fabric.
Oh, wow, wow. Because I can see it. It does look like knit lace now that you say it. But
Yep.
at first I thought it was the print of the fabric, but then it's the feel of it.
Yep,
That's so
it's
different.
just lace underneath of a sheer.
Okay, so usually with your quilts, even you said you've used wool on top of your cotton to give the poof, but this time you used...
This time I used the poly just because it's what I had at the time.
Okay.
But either a wool or a poly would be perfect for this application because you can really see that the dimension and the depth of the quilting.
Great, excellent, okay. Good, well, let's get on to the simulator.
All right. Okay, Jody, we're going to continue with this whole cloth layout. And remember in the beginning when I said, when I approach a layout, I think, do I start in the middle, work out, or do I start out and work in? Well, this time I'm going to start in the middle again, and I'm going to start with this beautiful Sharon Shambler feather block.
Oh.
Isn't that pretty?
It looks like Sharon.
I love feathers, and the pearls in there are beautiful. Now, when I approached this layout, I thought I want this to be a medallion, and I want it to be on point. So I just went in and I rotated that to be on point. The next thing I thought about is I have an infinity, I have that gorgeous amount of throat depth. I'm just going to make this medallion be the size that it needs to be so that I don't have to advance. So let's really quickly just resize this block. I have about 20 inches of stitching space, but I don't like to get too close to my rails. So let's just make it 19 and refresh.
Okay.
And remember, if we see those lines, all we have to do is click on File. All right, let's create ourselves an area that's as big as our design. We just made it 19 by 19. And it's not going to be in alignment, so let's quickly align it. These steps are should be familiar to you by now.
Repetitive.
They get
You
repetitive.
understand them.
Okay, now we want to fit a triangle unit into each one of those corners. So let's go ahead. This is just a fill triangle by Nancy Hackey of Wasatch Quilting. And let's just rotate it where it needs to be. Now we're gonna use a technique that we used early on. Let's lock our alignment. So let's align this triangle into position. Now it's into position, but it's not the right size, is it? So let's resize it. And because we've locked the position, it's gonna hold that position, and we'll just grow that triangle until it's as big as we want it to be. And we're in control. You can make it a little bit further away from the medallion, a little bit closer to the medallion. You decide. All right? That looks pretty good to me. Let's go through, and I'm gonna bypass a little bit of the naming this time. We'll just let the names the Pro Stitcher gives it stick.
Okay.
Okay, so let's go into single. We're gonna leave that a Sharon Shambler block, but we are gonna baseline. We've created that triangle. We're gonna leave it that name, and we're gonna baseline. Now we would be going through the same steps we did before to duplicate these patterns and just position them where they need to be. Okay, now all the while, I would be naming and saving these, right? But we're going in fast forward, fast motion today because I really want to show our viewers how easy it is to use your simulation to just quickly put together a whole cloth layout. And align it. And align it. Now I'm really quickly going to go back and baseline those. And what baseline is doing for me right now is helping to lock those positions. Okay, so I have everything baselined now. Okay, so let's move on to our outer border. We don't know exactly how big the border needs to be, but we're going to use our design to resize our border. So let's hit refresh. Let's bring that area back in. I could have left that up. Okay, we have our border unit selected. Let's align it now to the center. Close that box and align it to the top. And I'm just going to use my pattern that's selected. It's 3.35 inches. So let's go into our reposition, and I'm just going to nudge that pattern up into position. Just loosely place it. Now I could drag and drop it, but I don't find that that's as accurate when I'm doing my layouts. Okay, so I just nudged it to loosely where it needs to be. Now I can use this part of the design and watch my border as I resize it. So I'm going to resize it on the width, then I'll lock my aspect, and I'm just going to start popping that down a little bit. I'm watching, I'm watching, I'm watching. I'm looking to try to get that miter right in there where it needs to be. You see that?
Oh, yeah.
Okay, once I think I have it, let's go ahead and baseline that. That'll lock that position. Let's duplicate it. Let's rotate it. And let's align it. Now because we've changed the size of it a little bit, let's reevaluate. We dropped it down to 3.01, so now we can nudge that out into position. And now it becomes basically a game of fine tuning, okay? And that's the thing about whole cloth. I can't really tell you exactly the size it needs to be. You're just letting the pattern kind of create itself as you go through the steps, okay? So let me just try to baseline this and see if we can get that in position. I had the wrong, I had 30 inches instead of 3 inches, so 3.01.
There is a slight difference.
Yes, and there we go. So now if I wanted to take the time, I could fine tune the size of that a little bit because it's a little off. But for time purposes, why don't we just move on? That looks pretty good to me. Let's go up here. Okay, let's talk about this. When you're doing whole cloth layouts, ProStitcher is keeping track of the stitch order, okay? You can change the stitch order at any point in the process that you want.
Right.
Now this, we would have renamed these, right? But I skipped by that step. So we can go into stitch order and we can go into any of these designs and we can move that to the top. So let's say when we get to stitching, we want to stitch this first, right? So we can go and find that unit. There it is, because it's highlighted. But see how far down it is on the list? Well, we don't want it down there.
We can move it up.
We can move it up.
And this is why your labeling is so smart.
That's why, exactly.
Yeah.
So I could basically finish this out, but it's the same thing that we've been doing. We've been resizing things, we've been duplicating things, we're using our alignment. So it's all of those techniques that I've showed you, all wrapped into one to create something like this, to create something like the blue quilt behind us. It's just so much fun.
That's amazing. And you really, I mean, I see a lot of the repetition. I'm starting to really get it. But you go into this in so much more depth with your classes. There's so much to do and so much to know. Where can we find you, Melissa?
Well, you can find me on my website. It's www.mkquilts.com. Or you can find a lot of my work on my Facebook page, which is facebook.com/mkquiltsfl.
Wow. Okay. Thank you so much. This is so inspiring. I want to get my computer out and start playing. And then turn it into quilts.
Yes.
Thank you for watching Quilt at the Long Arm Quilting Show. We'll see you next time for more quilting fun and inspiration.
Thanks.